Good evening. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Dan Chartrand. I'm the owner of Street Bookstore. And I founded this store in 1991 on the banks of this tidal river, the southernmost branch of the Great Bay Estuary. Had to mention that tonight.
That's fair.
This building that this bookstore operates in has operated in for the last 27 years. The only home this store has ever had is in the floodplain. It's projected to be within sea rise, within sometime in the next 30 to 50 years. And this bookstore would not be able to operate in this place any longer. When that happens, not if that happens, when that happens. So some exceptional effort will have to be taken to prevent the rise, or we'll have to move up the street, or we'll have to be out of business. The floodplain that is projected to happen in the next 30 to 50 years does not extend to that end of Water Street. It's very specifically right here. But Exeter, as we know it, would be very different, will be very different when that happens. The mission of Water Street Bookstore is to build a diverse and vibrant community around the written word, full stop. That's what we do. Everything else is not our mission. And we are right on mission tonight, thanks to Elizabeth Rush agreeing to be here and build a community around this, this very real idea that life on the coast that we love, is going to change. And places that we love will not be here anymore. To get us to realize that in a book, in the pages of a single book, is quite an accomplishment. You're to be commended for having written this book and get us to begin the process of understanding that these places we love will no longer be here. Thanks for helping me to understand that. Elizabeth Rush and her work has appeared in the Washington Post, Harper's, Guernica, Granta, Orion, Pacific Standard, and the New Republic, among others. She is the recipient of fellowships and grants, including the Howard Foundation Fellowship awarded by Brown University, the Andrew Mellon Foundation Fellowship for Pedagogical Innovation in the Humanities, the Metcalf Institute Fellowship, and the Science and Society Journalism Award from the National Association of Science Writers. She received her MFA in nonfiction from Southern New Hampshire University, right here in Southern New Hampshire, just a little ways up the road, and her BA from Reed College. She now lives in Rhode Island, where she teaches creative nonfiction at Brown University. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Rush to Water Street Bookstore. She has written such an amazing book.
Thank you, Dan, for that really moving introduction. And I hate to admit this, but I never thought about this bookstore being in the floodplain until tonight, and it's there in the bookstore's name. And thanks to everyone for being here. I feel like so many of these readings, I've done a couple over the past month, feel like little homecomings in each place. In each place, I feel like I get to see friends and family, communities that I've written about, and people that I've been in touch with through the process of writing this book. And tonight's event here at Water Street Books is no different. So thank you all for being here. Many of you are part of the network of people that helped this book come into the world. I'm going to read from a chapter called Pulse. But first I'll tell you just a little bit about sort of the story behind Rising, and then I'd love to answer any questions that you have. So I was working as an international journalist about, I guess it was like 7 years ago. I was sent by Le Monde Diplomatique to do a story on the India-Bangladesh border fence. And I tended to, do a lot of on-the-ground research. And I spent about 3 weeks in India and about 3 weeks in Bangladesh. And the thing that really moved me in Bangladesh was that a lot of the farmers that I was speaking to, sometimes as far inland as 150 miles from the coast, would say to me, the border fence isn't really a problem. We can bribe our way through. People sneak their way through in the middle of the night. What is a problem is that we've started to have crop failure because there's saline being inundation in the aquifer. And another thing that really surprised me was that they were able to say, part of the reason why here, even 150 miles inland, we're getting this saline inundation is because most of Bangladesh is in the Ganges River delta. And upstream, a lot of the water had been diverted in India for agricultural projects to create farmland and otherwise sort of not arable land. And that lack of fresh water making its way into the Ganges River Delta had led to a drop in the aquifer, and that drop in the aquifer had also created space for saline inundation deep inland, far from the coast. And so people there told me, we're already leaving. We're giving up our family land. We can't farm here any longer. And I started to understand that not only was climate change real, not only was sea level rise real, it was happening now. And it was already people were already being displaced. And as those of you here who've worked as journalists know, I had a word count. My word count was like 2,100 words. My editor was like, this isn't a story on sea level rise. This is a story on the India-Bangladesh border fence. And so I was able to get like 200 extra words for a little sidebar about saline inundation and dislocation and how the damming of the Ganges River had led to that. But that was it. And so I came back to the U.S. and I had always wanted to be an environmental writer. I studied environmental writing as an undergrad. And I had written a lot about development in Southeast Asia for many years as a journalist. But I came back to the U.S. and I saw my chance. I knew I wanted to pivot, and I started to write about sea level rise. And I thought, okay, if it's happening in Bangladesh, it's happening here. And I'm going to go out and find those communities which are already being fundamentally reshaped by sea level rise. And I went to Louisiana, and it turns out that Louisiana has lost, over the past 50 years, land equal in size to the entire state of Delaware. And that's because of sea level rise, but it's also similarly because of the damming of the Mississippi River and the way those dams withhold silt behind each of them, silt that often would replenish the wetlands in the Mississippi River Delta. So you've got erosion, you've got sea level rise, and you also have sort of fundamental reshaping of wetlands habitats by oil and gas companies to extract oil from that area. So that's where I went first, and that's where I started to understand that the places that are being hardest hit now are often wetlands communities. And interestingly, over time, I started to realize that the people who live in and on wetlands are often, though not always, lower income, are often, though not always, people of color, indigenous people, blacks, Hispanics, Latin Americans, and that they're not getting a lot of the big multi-billion-dollar infrastructure design solutions to help them adapt to sea level rise. So that's what this book is really about. It's about going to different places in the United States and spending a lot of time on the ground in different coastal communities where sea level rise is already an issue. And it's about sort of drawing close to those whose lives are already being fundamentally reshaped and giving them space in this book to share their experience with others. Because another thing that I found pretty early on was that a lot of these people felt really alone in their experiences. Like, oh, no one understands what it's like to have the farmland that you've depended on disappear by degrees over decades because of saline intrusion. And the thing I started to realize was, yeah, there actually are a lot of people who understand that. There's a lot of people in this situation already, in the present tense. So though I'm not going to read one of these, every chapter in the book opens with something I call a testimony. And those are the result of extended interviews with individuals. And I would then go home and transcribe the entire interview and then edit out about 95% of the language until there's this one narrative arc. And each one sort of tells the story of how that individual began to understand that sea level rise was fundamentally changing their idea of home and what they did in response to it. So every chapter has one of those. The book spans, East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, Maine, Rhode Island, New York City, Louisiana, California. And today I'm going to read to you from a chapter in Florida. It takes place in Miami and is called Pulse. So I'll read this and then we can do some questions. Pulse. In 1890, just over 6,000 people lived in the damp lowlands of South Florida. Since then, the wetlands that covered half the state have largely been drained. Strip malls have replaced Seminole camps, and the population has increased 1,000-fold. Over roughly the same amount of time, the number of black college degree holders in the United States has also increased 1,000-fold, as did the speed at which we fly, the combined carbon emissions of the Middle East, and the entire population of Thailand. About 60 of the region's more than 6 million residents have gathered in the Cox Science Building at the University of Miami on a sunny Saturday morning to hear Harold Wanless, or Hal, chair of the geology department, speak about sea level rise. Only 7% of the heat being trapped by greenhouse gases is stored in the atmosphere, Hal begins. Do you know where the other 93% lives? A teenager, wrists lined in aquamarine beaded bracelets, rubs sleep from her eyes, returns her head to its resting position in her palm. The man seated behind me roots around in his briefcase for a breakfast bar. No one raises a hand. In the ocean, Hal continues. That heat is expanding the ocean, which is contributing to sea level rise. And it's also, more importantly, creating the setting for something we really don't want to have happen: rapid melt of ice. A woman wearing a sequin teal top opens her 5-star notebook and starts writing things down. The guy behind her shovels spoonfuls of passion fruit flavored Chobani yogurt into his tiny mouth. Hal's 3 sons are perched in the next row back. One has a ponytail, one is in a suit, and the third crosses and uncrosses his gray street sneakers. The one with the ponytail brought a water bottle. The other 2 sip Starbucks. And behind the rows and rows of sparsely occupied seats, at the very back of the amphitheater, an older woman with a gold brocade bear on her top paces back and forth. A real estate developer interrupts Hal to ask, "Is someone recording this?" "Yes," the cameraman coughs. "Besides," Hal adds, "I say the same damn thing at least 5 times a week." Hal, who's in his early 70s and has been studying sea level rise for over 40 years, pulls at his Burt Reynolds mustache, readjusts his taupe corduroy suit, and continues. On the screen above his head, clips from a documentary on climate change show glacial tongues of ice the size of Manhattan tumbling into the sea. The big story in Greenland and Antarctica is that the warming ocean is working its way in, deep under the ice sheets, causing the ice to collapse faster than anyone predicted, which in turn will cause sea levels to rise faster than anyone predicted. According to Marco Rubio, the junior senator from Florida, rising sea levels are uncertain, their connection to human activity tenuous. And yet the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change expects roughly 2 feet of rise by century's end. The United Nations predicts 3 feet, and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration estimates an upper limit of 6.5 feet. Take the 6 million people who live in South Florida today and divide them into 2 groups. Those who live 6.5 feet above the current high tide line and everybody else. The numbers slice nearly evenly. Heads or tails, call it in the air. If you live here, all you can do is hope that when you put down roots, your choice was somehow prophetic. But Hal says it doesn't matter whether you live 6 feet above sea level rise or 65, because he, like James Hansen, believes that all of these predictions are, to put it mildly, very, very low. The rate of sea level rise is currently doubling every 7 years. And if it were to continue in this manner, Ponzi scheme style, we would have 205 feet of sea level rise by 2095, he says. And while I don't think we're going to get that much water by the end of the century, I do think we have to take seriously the possibility that we could have something like 15 feet by then. It's a little after 9 o'clock. Hal's sons stop sipping their lattes, and the oceanographic scientist behind me puts down his handful of M&Ms. If Hal Wanless is right, every single object I have seen over the past 72 hours, the periodic table of elements hanging above his left shoulder, the buffet currently loaded with refreshments, the smoothie stand at my seaside hotel, the beach umbrellas and oxygen bars, the Johnny Rockets and the seashell shop, the lecture hall with its hundreds of mostly empty teal swivel chairs will all be underwater in the not-so-distant future. Dig into geologic history and you discover this. When sea levels have risen in the past, they have usually not done so gradually, but rather in rapid surges, jumping as much as 50 feet in 3 short centuries. Scientists call these events meltwater pulses because the near-biblical rise in the height of the ocean is directly correlated to the melting of ice and the process of deglaciation. The very events featured in the documentary footage Hal has got running on a screen above his head. Hal shows us a clip of this largest glacial calving event ever recorded. It starts with a chunk of ice the size of Miami's tallest building, tumbling, head over tail, off the tip of the Greenland ice sheet. Then the Southeast Financial Center goes, displaying its cool blue underbelly. It's a coltish thing, smooth and oddly muscular. The ground between the two turns to Arctic ice dust, and the ocean roils up. Next, chunks of ice the size of the marquee residences crash away, and then the Wells Fargo Center goes, and with it goes 900 Biscayne Bay. Suddenly, everything between the Brickell neighborhood and Park West is gone. The clip begins again, and I watch in awe as a section of the Jacobspian Glacier, half the size of all of Miami, falls into the sea. Greenland is currently calving chunks of ice so massive they produce earthquakes up to 6 and 7 on the Richter scale, Hal says, as the city of ice breaks apart. There was not much noticeable ice melt before the 90s, and now it accelerates every year, exceeding all predictions. It will likely cause a pulse of meltwater into the oceans. In medicine, a pulse is something regular, a predictable throb of blood through veins produced by a beating heart. It is reliable and steady, so definite that to lack a pulse is sometimes considered synonymous with death. A healthy adult will have a resting heart rate of 60 to 100 beats per minute every day until they don't. But a meltwater pulse is the opposite. It's an anomaly, the exception to the 15,000-year rule. From 1900 to 2000, the glacier on the screen retreated 8 miles. From 2001 to 2010, it pulled back 9 more. Over a single decade, the Jacobsvin Glacier lost more ice than it had during the previous century. And then there's this film clip recorded over 70 minutes in which the glacier retreats a full mile across a calving face 3 miles wide. This is why I believe we're witnessing the beginning of the largest meltwater pulse in human history, Hal says. As the ice sheet above Hal's head falls away and the snacks on the buffet disappear, topography is transformed from a backwater physical science into the single most important factor determining the longevity of the Sunshine State. The man seated next to me leans over. If what he says is even half true, the man whispers, Florida's about to be wiped off the map. A few days later, I spend the afternoon in Shorecrest, a neighborhood a couple miles north of downtown. To get there, I leave the beach behind and drive past Archie's Live Bait and Tackle, deals and discounts to Raphael Food Store, Royal Budget Inn, Family Dollar, and the Goodwill. As I continue north, the buildings all lose their mirrored glass and their extra floors, until most are single-story and made from stucco. It isn't raining when I arrive in Shorecrest, and there isn't a storm offshore. The day is as clear and as blue as the filigree on a porcelain plate. But the streets are still full of water. I watch as a woman wades ankle-deep across 10th Avenue. She's gathered her long, russet-colored skirt in her right hand, and in her left hand she holds a pair of Jesus sandals. When she reaches the bus stop, she sits and puts her shoes on. On the corner, a man stands facing traffic, holding a sign that simply reads, "Please help, food." We get flooded with just about every high tide, the woman tells me, glancing in the direction of the panhandler and the approaching bus. And if the moon is big, it's worse. All along the East Coast, from Portland, Maine to Key West, sunny day flooding is increasingly frequent. Many places in the Sunshine State are so low-lying that high tide, when coupled with something as innocuous as a full moon, can cause the streets to brim with water. Sometimes the tide simply rises above the seawalls and starts to slip into the roadways. In other cases, it enters the neighborhood through the stormwater infrastructure underground. The very pipes designed to reduce flooding by ushering rain out instead give salt water a chance to work its way in. In Shorecrest, I spend a minute watching the bay burble up through the street grate and onto Northeast Little River Drive before whipping out my camera and snapping half a dozen photos. Just then, a man walks up behind me, peers down, and says, "I've seen fish come swimming out." "No, you haven't." "I have," he says, pushing his sunglasses up. "I've been here 20 years. When I first moved, we used to flood once a year, maybe twice, and now it's constant." His name is Robert Cisneros. He grew up in Cuba and moved to Florida in 1962, dropping the final O in Roberto. He thought the name change might help his fledgling boat repair company succeed. I had heard about the flooding in Shorecrest from Nicole Hernandez-Hammer, a sea level rise researcher turned advocacy coordinator for the Union of Concerned Scientists. The daughter of Cuban and Guatemalan immigrants, Nicole left academia for activism when she observed firsthand the disproportionate risk that climate change poses for the Latinx communities of South Florida. We know that people of color are often the most vulnerable to climate change, and that these communities also tend to receive disproportionately low funding for adaptation, resiliency, and relocation, she told me over the phone. "You're staying out on the beach, right? Just drive up to Shorecrest. It'll take you 20 minutes, and you'll see what I mean." Robert points to his house and his yard, which are catty-corner from the drain we stand by, and says, "I used to have a nice garden here, and now you see how it is. The water comes in and sits, and everything dies because of the salt. It's not rain that floods this place, it's the ocean. I bought some stones to put here to try to keep the water out, but what else can I do? I ask if the city is helping the neighborhood to come up with short-term solutions, and Robert gets upset. I think they need to raise the street, they need to install pumps, but those are the kinds of things that only happen on the beach. They're not giving any of us here any relief. Like Miami Beach, Shorecrest was built atop a former wetland. On the Strip, where billions of dollars in real estate investment are at risk, the government is using a mix of property taxes and municipal bonds to invest in formal sea level rise adaptation. But in Shorecrest, Hialeah, and Sweetwater, low to middle income neighborhoods where the majority of residents are people of color, they're expected to remove their shoes and wade through the water. Robert shakes his head in disbelief. I wanted to leave this house to my kids, but soon it's going to be worthless, he says. On his stoop sit 2 pairs of rubber boots, ready for the flood that is already here. The following Friday, as I drive back to the Koch Science Center, I think about what would happen if the water stored in Antarctica and Greenland's ice sheets were released. The Atlantic would rise up over the driveways, up over our decorative bushes and front steps, up over the decks and railings, up over the windows and the roof gables, until all of our coastal homes disappeared beneath the flat blue surface of the sea, where clouds would skate and bloom, as though nothing and no one had ever existed below. I drive past the high-rises currently under construction, with breezy names like Aria on the Bay and One Paraiso and Solitaire. Past 2 Lamborghinis, 2 Ferraris, 1 Rolls-Royce, and 1 brand new Bentley with a matte coat of white paint and chrome hubcaps. Past the port where 6 cruise ships pause. Past a string of coin-sized islands with not-so-coin-sized houses. Star and Fisher, Bell and Hibiscus, San Marco and Rivo Alto. And as I pass, I imagine all of it underwater. Past the new Perez Art Museum, which already sits on 15-foot-high stilts as a safeguard against higher tides, stronger storms, and severe flooding. Past the Crescent Heights Inspirational Construction Site on the corner of Alton and 6th Street, the intersection that flooded twice in 2000, 4 times in 2010, and 8 times in 2013. Past the floodwater pumps and the street elevation projects meant to serve the imagined residents of The Wave, the name Crescent Heights Inspirational Living gave to their new development. Past CVS, Walgreens, H&M, and Forever 21. Past Petco Animal Supplies and Wet Willie's Cocktail Lounge. Past the South Seas Hotel and Eden Rock, the Shore Club, and the Ritz. Past a couple with sun hats and beach chairs and a dachshund. In my mind, there's no tidal wave and no wreckage. Instead, everything is simply, coolly covered in blue. I'm ashamed to say that when I finally reach the Koch Science Building, I sit in my Toyota Yaris, my rented Toyota Yaris, and feel something close to smug. I imagine this is how the Oracle of Delphi felt, divining the future from a fistful of smoke. Love of money, nothing else will ruin Sparta, she said to Lucretius. Yes, I think, love of money, nothing else will ruin Miami. But then I remember that water is not discerning. It doesn't know the difference between a millionaire and the person who repairs the millionaire's yacht. The thought stops me in my self-righteous tracks. I once heard Katie Ford read from a book of poems she wrote after Katrina. She said, in a voice I understood as God's voice on the night the water arrived in the city, "What do you expect me to do? I am not human. I gave you each other. So save each other." That night the moon is big and full, making the ocean weightier. The salt water unspools in the streets and continues drowning by degrees the low-lying land that lines our shore. Soon, I think, if Hal is right, all of this will be underwater, not just temporarily, but for good. In the meantime, in Miami Beach, the water pumps whir. Well, 5 miles north of here, there is a barefooted woman who carries her sandals in her hands, wades through the Olivet that is always now rising. I would love to answer questions if you guys have any.
I'm just curious about the research process to some extent, the talking to people. You arrive at someplace you may or may not have ever been before, and you have to find out who will talk to you, who makes sense. How did you go about getting people to open up? I know part of it is, as you said, people felt alone, so they wanted to talk, but I'm just curious as to how that kind of went in some of these instances.
I think that I sort of had 2 different techniques, both of them very lo-fi. One thing that I did in almost every community, I did 2 things. I did a lot of door knocking, and that essentially, so if I had a rented car, for instance, I would often park that car on the outskirts of the neighborhood. I didn't want to arrive in a neighborhood in a fancy new car that was sort of immediately physically distance me from residents there, because a lot of the places that I'm writing about are pretty low to middle income. So I would often park on the outskirts of the neighborhood and start walking through the neighborhood and knocking on doors. And I think being a woman and a writer, that in a weird way makes you immediately vulnerable. You're sort of hey, I'm here, I'm unarmed, I'm willing to talk to you on your porch or maybe in your living room, depending on how I feel. So I think in some sense, my willingness to be a little bit vulnerable initially was a good first step towards sort of getting people to open up to me. And then the second thing that I realized pretty early on when I was writing about Louisiana was that I had to take that one step further. And I remember I was on the Isle de Jean Charles, which is an island that Beasts of the Southern Wild was based on. That sort of indie film from about 7 years ago now. They had a decent amount of press, and people were sort of oh, another one. And I was at the time actually in the process of leaving what I think later I would recognize as a fairly abusive or manipulative relationship. And when I started conversations and I let myself as a human being be part of the conversation and say, you know what, I'm curious how you guys think about how to leave this island, if you're going to leave this island that you love. I only know it from my own personal experience, and I've been trying to figure out how to leave a person that I love, but that is no longer, treating me well or that I don't see a future with. And this place where you've made your lives used to be your home, but it started to not act that way. And how do you make sense of that? So I felt like the more I could be myself and be present in those conversations and not just be a journalist who wants to extract information and leave, also really helped. A lot of the places I would spend a long amount of time in. So the Staten Island chapter was written over 3 years. The Louisiana chapter I visited 3 times. There's 2 Louisiana chapters. Each of those engagements, except for one, was, a couple weeks at least, which in a small community allows you some time to get to know people. So there's door knocking. And then the other thing I would say is that if I could, I would try to identify some kind of leader in the community and get to know them and then ask them to introduce me to people. Because essentially you're always looking to gain people's trust. And if you find a leader that you really like and that you think is in some way you're simpatico with, or that you feel that you do want to enter the community through that leader, they're placing trust in you helps other people place trust in you. So those are my two sort of tips. Yeah.
So your book is clearly like a political book about very real things, but also there seems to be a very narrative aspect to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering like what your opinion is or view is about like using narrative in a way to like approach the subject and what that does for that kind of thing.
Sure. I have a friend who is a political journalist in Washington, D.C., and she writes a lot about climate change. And I was staying with her when I did an event in Washington, D.C. about a month ago. And she said to me, "Your book's amazing. You don't interview a single politician." And I hadn't realized it until she said it to me. And I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. I didn't interview us. I mean, I did, but they didn't make it into the book. And I think that was a really deliberate decision in a way. The decision not to include politicians wasn't deliberate, but the decision to make people, everyday people whose lives and livelihoods are being fundamentally reshaped by sea level rise, the heart of this book, was a very deliberate decision. And I think to have them enter into the story, what amazed me as I carried out that research was just sitting at their feet and listening to their stories and realizing that every human being has the ability to tell a story, to make sense of the world around them with storytelling. And I think we need to do more of that in the context of climate change, because I think it's often dealt with as a political topic or a scientific topic. And I think storytelling can help it enter into the realm of the everyday, and also can help us sort of start to understand our pathways through and also our ability to change some of the stories that we're weaving with our actions every day. So I think it's really important, and sort of surprising to me that it's only now gaining momentum in the world of climate change communication to think about putting, frontline communities at the center of the story, and then also to really value storytelling and literature and poetry and the lyric in that context, I think is really important, and also helps us sort of not tune it out. I can tune out political writing on climate change like anybody, even though I care about the topic a lot. It makes it real, and it makes it emotional, and it makes it feel like something that, okay, if someone is suffering in that community, I have to take that suffering seriously. And that's different than sort of like the political chess game, which is easier for me not to care so much about. Good question.
Do the scientists know that this is happening, and are they collecting data from every river that's connected to the ocean throughout the country, or are they not aware of it?
I mean, I think there's some of the book that also is sort of reported in the field with field scientists as they're collecting their data. It's absolutely something that scientists know is happening, but it's also, collecting data is incredibly, painstakingly time intensive. And so, no, we don't have data from every single river in the country or every tidal outlet. And every tidal system is a little bit different than the next one. But there are a number of projects all around the country that are trying to capture the rate at which saltwater marshes are drowning. And so what are the things that are exacerbating that? How do we put more silt into the water column? There's all different kinds of wetlands research and rehabilitation projects that are attempting to both understand what's happening, get a sense of how it's happened in the past, understand how what's happening right now is in some ways, scientists think, fundamentally physically different than how it's happened in the past because of the rate of change. So, a number you probably hear a lot if you pay attention to climate change reporting is this number 400 parts per million. We now have like 410 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The last time that happened was about 2.6 million years ago. So it has happened before. But we've gone from 300 parts per million to 410 parts per million in the span of 100 years. And we don't know that there's any scientific precedent for how quickly that change has happened. So there have been pulses of meltwater in the past. They can correlate those in some cases to changes in atmospheric carbon, but they don't think that that much carbon has entered into the atmosphere that quickly. They don't know that it's ever happened in such a short span of time. So will that pulse happen even quicker? We're not entirely sure. So they're working on it, but it's hard to cover all of the locations. I just found out that I'll go next year to the Thwaites Glacier, which is the cork to the West Antarctic ice sheet. And it's melting really rapidly. It's a part of Antarctica that's only been visited by 28 human beings ever. I mean, it's hard to get data from so remote a location. And so we're working on it, but the US and the British government have to partner to send that boat to Thwaites because it's incredibly expensive. It's the single largest US-British partnership in Antarctica in 80 years. So they're out there, they're working on it, but it's impossible to get data from every coastal ecosystem or every glacier. We just can't do it. Other questions? Yes.
I found your book very readable, and part of it was that you included scientific data, but it wasn't overwhelmed by that. How did you decide on a balance? And how did you make decisions to limit that or what to bring in? Because it could have been totally overwhelming.
As I write, I read a lot of my work out loud. And for sure, the scientific sections, some of them were quite a bit longer, and I would notice myself getting bored as I read it out loud, and I was like, well, that's a problem, so that was like, I think sometimes through the process of doing the thing, you start to make some of those decisions. It wasn't, again, like a super deliberate decision, but I knew that I have to read tons of scientific papers on climate change all the time, and they're hugely boring. And if someone wasn't like paying me to read them, there's no way I'd read them because they're painful to read. So, I knew that the book had to not be that. And reading it out loud helped me figure out when I really had to like rein myself in. And so there's often, I think, a lot of weaving in the book where you have like a paragraph of scientific data and then you have some scene writing and then there's some dialogue. And it's, the basics of creative nonfiction is you can't just dump a lot of information in there. You have to get that information in through storytelling and scene writing. And in some case, like lyric, poetic prose.
I also found the fact that you were willing to include writing from the people that you were writing about. I thought that was tremendously powerful. The woman who lost her father, how were you able to decide that you were going to include writing from other people like that?
So, yeah, those are the testimonies that start each chapter. And again, so the story that she's referencing is a story that opens the Staten Island chapter. And, I had been writing about a community in coastal Staten Island that was devastated by Sandy. And in the wake of Sandy, residents came together and started to petition the state and say, we don't feel safe living here anymore. We want you to buy our homes and demolish them and let them go back to wetlands. And this was like a Republican-dominated working-class community. advocating for managed retreat, which is considered like one of the most progressive climate change adaptation strategies we have. And quite frankly, that just shocked me. And so I started writing about this community, and I had probably been writing about them and spending time. I would ride my bike out there, I'd walk around, I'd talk to people, I'd door knock. I'd probably been there like 6 months, and it was the 2-year anniversary of Sandy, and this woman who I'd been writing about, Patty Schneider, said, you know, why don't you come to a celebration of life party that we're having at my house? My brother Leonard was killed in the storm, and we're having this ceremony to remember his life. And so I went, and his daughter pulled me aside and said, you're writing a book, and you're going to help commemorate my father. So I'm going to tell you the story of the night of Hurricane Sandy. And she just closed the door and sat me down and told me the story. And it took like 2 hours. And it's like the most moving thing I've ever heard in my life. And I recorded the entire thing. And I just didn't know what to do with it for a really long time. And then a colleague at Bates, Jane Kosla, actually gave me a book called Voices from Chernobyl, which is a collection of like 87 testimonies of different people who lived in and around the Chernobyl power plant, leading up to, during, and after the explosion. And it's just their voices. And a light went off in my head. I was like, oh, I can do that too. I didn't know it existed. I didn't know it was possible. But that book helped me understand I could actually just have the voices of some of these people in the book. And as a writer, like, they were better storytellers than I could ever be of that story. I felt like if I did anything to Nicole Montalto's story of Sandy, I'd just make it so much less than what it was when she told it to me. So that's sort of how those came into the book. And they're a part of the book that people are really responding to strongly, and that I'm really proud that they're in there. Maybe one more question?
With all these different groups that you met and individuals that you met that have been impacted by climate change, and I think that's really the heart of the whole story, even if I'm not scientifically oriented. I mean, that's what you remember. Was the one striking characteristic that really struck you about one or more of these groups or individuals from these various parts of the country that you came away with maybe not realizing you're going to experience when you at first were going to be interviewing them?
Yeah, this is, I think the thing that was most striking to me was that I thought going into the book that the decision to leave a home that's just clearly repetitively being ruined by flooding would be like a logical one. I was like, okay, your home's flooded 3 times in 10 years, you leave that home. That makes sense to me. Like, don't really know why you would stay. And I thought of it so rationally going into the book. And the thing I realized in hearing all these stories is that it is an individual decision that has to be arrived at. And that it's a story that if you're in that position, you want to maintain control over it. You want to be able to tell the story about how you chose to leave the place that's long defined you. And I think the thing that a lot of people maybe didn't know, that there are programs in our federal and state governments, particularly through disaster recovery, that help people move permanently out of the floodplain. FEMA runs something called the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and it's usually used to move riverine communities out of the floodplain, but it's being used more and more to move coastal communities out of the floodplain. And it's interesting, communities where there's been a lot of repetitive flooding, and the federal government comes in and says, we want to purchase and demolish your homes. Residents are like, no way, Jose, that's my home. You can't tell me where to go. And in communities where a resident finds out about the program and starts sharing the information amongst and between members of that community. Did you know that this was a possibility? Maybe we could advocate for this. We might be able to get, pre-storm prices for our homes and purchase another home nearby. When it happens sort of from the grassroots up, from the ground up, there's a lot more buy-in for it. And so that's, I think, in many ways what I really hope the book can do is deepen and broaden the national conversation around retreat as a resiliency strategy and get that idea into people's heads as a possibility. Because I don't think we can just sort of hammer it from the top down and tell people they have to leave. That's not going to work. But I do think we have to wrap our minds around the fact that some of our lowest lying communities will be underwater in the future, and what we're going to do about that and how we're going to come to terms with that is very much on us. And I think we have to start having those conversations now. If we can empower residents to do it in a way that makes them feel in charge of their own stories, that's what I'd like to see happen. So on that note, thank you, and